Allado-McDowell is a writer, artist, and musician. A foundational figure in the field of AI literature, they have authored several books with GPT-3, co-edited and contributed to multiple anthologies, and regularly publish essays on art, AI, and ecology.
They created the
neuro opera. It's a neuro opera Song of the Ambassadors, and recorded and released music under the name Qenric. KSA established the Artist plus Machine Intelligence License program at Google.
They are a conference speaker, educator, and consultant to institutions seeking
to align their work with deeper traditions of human understanding.
I wish I could see everybody. So I am going to talk a little bit about this framework that I've been, there we go, to understand AI as something that I'm calling neural media. I'll get more into the details of that, but basically I'll do a little bit of, I'll just talk about my own work and then give a little bit of historical context for this idea and talk about some of the implications. And I'm going to try and move quickly since we are behind schedule. So my name's Allado-McDowell. If you're familiar with my work, it might be because of this book called Pharmaco-AI that I wrote. I am involved in AI research. I have been for over 10 years, and this was my first experiment with collaborative AI writing. So this came out in 2020, and I wrote it with GPT-3. I used a convention to distinguish my voice from the AI's voice and a sort of iterative process and collaborative process of meaning making where my prompts led to AI responses in this kind of cycle. And so the book is an intertwining of human and generative thought. I've written a couple other books. This is my anti-romance novel called A More Cringe. Another novel I wrote called Air Age Blueprint came out in 2023, and I recently, last year, released a comic, which is a collaboration with the artist Elon Manuik using Midjourney to illustrate my comic book story. I've produced opera. I'm working on another operatic work right now. Here is the audience at the Lincoln Center. This opera was a collaboration with neuroscientists who are studying the effects of sound on the human brain. And here's some of the data that we generated during the opera. But I include this especially to show that AI and neuroscience and EEG and things like this kind of perception of the brain can actually all fit under a larger category that I call neural media. And there's a historical definition that I'm going to present to you now of that idea. So we're all very, very familiar with generative imagery, AI generation, generative AI. And this is something that's come to prominence in the last couple of years, but as far back as 2015, AIs were generating images. And I was working on a team at Google Research at that time, and this image leaked to Reddit, and it came from somebody on our team. It's called Trippy Squirrel, and it was the impetus for the creation of a program which I started and led at Google for many years called Artist and Machine Intelligence. And so as early as 2015, we were thinking about how might AI be an artistic medium for the 21st century? What does it mean that this thing is happening now? What does it mean that it's generating imagery, and in particular, this very psychedelic imagery that's somewhat grotesque? What can we do with artists to explore this? And so in constructing a program inside of a corporation, a very large corporation at that, in 2015, I looked to some historical precedents, one of which was the 9 Evenings event that was put on by Experiments in Art and Technology at Bell Labs in I guess this was 50 years previous, so that would have been in 1965. So this was an event that happened in New York, where artists like John Cage, Merce Cunningham, Robert Rauschenberg were collaborating with with engineers at the at Bell Labs to put on these performances over 9 nights. The Experiments in Art and Technology program had existed for a while before that, but this was kind of one of their most iconic events. It was not necessarily considered a massive success by the culture world, but it was a very bold attempt to kind of merge engineering and art and theater and performing arts. And in doing research on this historical moment and trying to understand where it came from and how we might think about constructing a similar program in 2015, I came across the research of Fred Turner, who's a Stanford historian. He's covered the relationship between Silicon Valley and the counterculture, from cyberculture to counterculture is one of his books. And there's another one called The Democratic Surround, which talks about this moment and many other moments. His research goes all the way back to something called the Committee for National Morale, which was started in 1940 to address the ways that propaganda and scientific psychology were being used in World War II. So the first sentence here, the present war is in large measure ideological. Ideas are being used for political and military purposes with greater skill and ruthlessness than ever before. This sentiment that Germany has mobilized and employed the resources of scientific psychology with an unprecedented audacity and thoroughness. This idea that in order to be competitive, the United States needed to engage in psychological operations, essentially, to build morale. This was the fundamental idea that motivated this committee, and they formulated some ideas about media, which went on to become very important. The key, I guess, directional insight was something called comparative national psychology. So the idea was that, they believed that Americans had a fundamental psychological disposition, which was different from the German disposition, and that media could manipulate the psychology of Americans, but only if it was constructed in a certain way. So they formulated very early the idea of an influencer or a peer influencer, a network of peers that influence thought. And basically what they were doing was trying to construct a theory of media that could appeal to an anti-authoritarian character that they identified in the American psyche, and that this could only be done through peer influence and through the offering of choice and the creation of a kind of space of images through which individuals could construct a narrative, an identity, a relationship with media. And so this idea of choice and individuality were the elements that they were deciding to manipulate in order to increase the morale for the war. And this has led me to think about a variety of moments in the history of media as moments of what Louis Althusser would call interpellation. So this idea that structures of state or society, or by extension media, they produce identities, put them on offer, and allow people to select from those identities, or they offer identities for inhabitation by subjects. So this idea of interpellation, is a French word. One of the valences of the word is to hail or to call. So the canonical example is a police officer. If you're walking down the street and a police officer says, "You there," they are interpellating you as a criminal. They're giving you the opportunity to respond and say, "Me," and put yourself into the role of the criminal. And so this, by analogy, is what happens with all forms of state apparatus, cultural apparatus, media apparatus. And we'll get into the details of how that works in various media types. But in Fred Turner's history of not only Silicon Valley, but this early moment in American propaganda, he talks about a distinction that was made by the participants between broadcast media and surround media. So as the documents show, broadcast media was correlated to a fascistic entrainment to a single source of information. So the radio, the television would broadcast a signal that was one signal, and a large mass of people would entrain to it. And this was believed to produce a fascistic alignment of humans in politics. And what came out of the Committee for National Morale, was the emphasis on a democratic media type, and what Turner calls surround media. And so this is the basic distinction, is a correlation between the structures of media and a governance model. And I spent some time thinking about this and putting it into the context of AI in our current moment. And I've come up with a slightly more elaborate framing for it. And I've also renamed, we're going to have to go through a little bit of the structure here, and then we'll get into the details that will make it much more concrete. But what Turner calls surround, I have named immersive, in order to tie it into some of the things that are happening in our own time with media, to make it feel a little bit more connected to what we're experiencing. So let's start with broadcast media. I've taken these 4 categories and correlated them to 30-year intervals in history. So each category is born in a certain time and evolves over a 30-year period. It matures during that period, and then it becomes the baseline and foundation for the next layer of media. As Marshall McLuhan said, every medium basically subsumes the previous medium. The content of the new medium is the previous medium. So let's start with broadcast media. In each of these categories, there's the birth and the 30-year period of maturation. There's a space that's produced, a physical space is produced by the medium, the way that we interact with it. There's a type of content that fills the medium, and then all of this together produces an identity that is interpolated. We're offered an identity through the medium, we're formed by it, and we choose consciously or otherwise to inhabit that identity. So in the case of broadcast media, as I've said before, it's centralized, it converges. The content is a program, I'll get into what that means, and the identity is demographic, and we'll talk about how demography plays a role in forming identity in the mid-20th century. So it's a centralized space with programmed content for demographic identities. When I say centralized, it means that we literally gather physically in one space. So television altered the social landscape because people, when they were able to gather around a radio or a television, suddenly converged in a single space. It could be inside of a home, it could be inside of a public place like a bar, but this was a new phenomenon where this broadcast medium literally collected people into a single space. Nielsen, the ratings company, essentially the first ad tech company, created essentially the field of demographics by trying to understand who was watching television when, who was listening to the radio when. So they began by creating research, marketing research and performance surveys. When radio was introduced, they created something called they acquired the rights to something called the audimeter, which is a device that would exist inside of the radio, and it would record when it was turned on and what station it was tuned to. This same idea of recording when the radio or television was turned on and what channel it was tuned to became the mechanism for the Nielsen rating system, but it also was based on certain understandings of who the audience was at the time that the television was turned on. So that understanding of the audience is fundamentally demographic. So they could say very crudely, we have, this house is located in this neighborhood. it's within this economic class, it's within this racial group, it's within this age group. And so the idea of tuning programs for specific demographics became possible because of the understanding that was had through devices like the odometer and the Nielsen rating system. And that construction of the audience. So here you can see gender, age, this construction of a subject becomes embodied in the content. And so when you look at the content of this period, you can see that certain identities are present within it, that it has a kind of structured program, and programs like a television program, they slot into these demographic profiles. Certain people will be watching TV at certain times. Let's produce content for them, we'll produce programs for them. But then inside of those programs, there are identities. And so there's a kind of centralization of the range of possible identities that is distributed to different demographics. So for example, late night television, you have the TV show host like Johnny Carson, you have the comic wearing a tuxedo and making jokes and drinking, and this is kind of an adult form of content. You have this sort of nuclear family gathered around to watch the evening news with the patriarchal kind of father figure delivering reality and kind of narrating reality for you. You have the family sitcom. And so there are all these systems through which identities are put on display in a programmatic way that are then distributed to people whose identities are understood by the system to be demographic. It's a way of perceiving who's consuming the media. Now, the Committee for National Morale really wanted to move to a more democratic understanding of identity. Well, I mean, fundamentally, they assumed an anti-authoritarian and democratic idea of identity and wanted to encourage that. So the idea of centralization through broadcast media was associated with fascism, with entrainment of groups, and they came up with this idea that media should be more spatially immersive and distributed. And this is what Turner calls the surround. And you'll see some images that might look familiar of the kinds of environments that were created. Probably the most famous would be the acid tests of the 1960s and the kind of projections and this hippie light shows, but it goes way back before that. And so the properties of immersive media that I've identified here is that it's distributed in space. It produces a space characterized by distribution, by being spread and surrounding. The content is meant to produce an experience. It's experiential, so immersive experiential media. And the identity is one that is constructed or democratic, meaning one chooses which pieces to look at and decides what, in a democratic way, how they will participate. It's a distributed space providing an experience for constructing identities. So this goes back to the Bauhaus. Herbert Bayer had this notion of dynamism and a 360-degree field of vision, as opposed to the perspective, the single point perspective or 2-point perspective from the Renaissance. So this was the idea that we were now, the fundamental perspective we would inhabit was one of a surrounding, immersive, 360-degree field. These ideas were tested out in exhibitions in the 30s and even embodied a kind of global picture through this exhibition in 1943, Airways to Peace by Herbert Bayer. This is the first kind of exhibition with a dome in it, and the dome is actually an inversion of the globe. You go inside it. It's called Airways to Peace because this was talking about how flight paths and military flight paths could produce a global order and connect people around the world. This is the beginning of global liberalism. Edward Seichen's Family of Man exhibition, 12 years later, shows how this surround idea could be inhabited, how pictures from around the world could surround the viewer and they could start to see themselves as part of this global picture, but also make choices about where their attention is placed at different times. This was not a sort of linear guided experience. It was not a broadcast media experience. It was something that was all around you. and you then constructed meaning by the juxtaposition of images that you were choosing to look at different times. This was exported to the world's fairs. So Glimpses of the USA by Charles and Ray Eames is the international exhibition. This was in Moscow at the World Fair. These are films about the freeway system, about the American freeway system. Another innovation from the war that became cultural and urban infrastructure, but was also part of the propaganda narrative of American freedom, et cetera, et cetera. This way of thinking, immersive, surround, open environments for people to make choices, influenced the Fluxus movement, Ellen Capro's Yard, these happenings, and this is a piece from 1961 where the gallery was filled with tires and people just kind of hung out inside there and figured out what they wanted to do with it. It was this idea of autonomy and choosing your own path through an environment. This led directly to the light shows and the experiences that were put on by groups like the Merry Pranksters. Of course, they added LSD and psychedelic rock to the mix, but fundamentally, this type of environment, projection environment, like this piece by Stan Vanderbeek, who was a Bell Labs alumni, it all operated in the same logic. So those teenagers and young people in the hippie movement probably saw these exhibitions from the 1950s. And so what really reads as counterculture to us now is fundamentally something that was produced by the establishment to create a certain psychological state. I mean, the origins of this go all the way back to the Committee for National Morale. But they were appropriated and transformed and kind of turned into something else. The fundamental message remained the same: individual choice, democratic society. And these, you could also read it as false choice or consumer consciousness. Again, this is the, 1966, this is the kind of beginning of that movement becoming mainstream. This merges directly into Stuart Brand's Whole Earth movement, the Back to the Land idea. This is like individuals moving through these communities and creating these paradigms and publications to inhabit, to promote the ideas of like the hippie Back to the Land idea, but also translating certain countercultural impulses across cultural sectors. So the Homebrew Computer Club in the 1980s in the Bay Area was the origin of Apple Computer, Silicon Valley's home computing movement. Silicon Valley itself was a military industrial operation for decades before it became associated with the counterculture. So there's a convergence of these things through publications like the Whole Earth catalog. And now this immersive paradigm continues with Burning Man, with the Van Gogh immersive exhibition, immersive experience, with the Sphere in Las Vegas. These feel very futuristic and new, but in a sense, they're conceptually were seeded almost 100 years ago and really took that time to mature and become mainstream. So what people have called new media or things like this are really fundamental to fundamental layers of the media environment that emerge post broadcast media. And of course, the idea of immersion becomes totalizing, in that sphere, that dome becomes virtual and surrounds you in the VR environment. There's literally the construction of this type of virtual 3D space and the placement of these images within it in VR. So that brings us to network media, which is born in the 1980s as the internet goes from being a fallback system for a post-nuclear scenario to becoming the backbone of our daily communication and entertainment. I'm going to try and go quickly here, but the space it produces is a decentralized space. The content that inhabits it is fundamentally mimetic. It's the meme, and the identities that are produced within it are fractal. So what does that mean? for it to be a circulatory space for mimetic content and fractal identities. Well, if you look at the internet, this is a mapping of the internet structure, you'll see that it has a circulatory nature. It looks like lungs, veins, nervous system, neurons, and as it's matured and become part of our daily lives, the mimetic nature of it became the unit of communication. These are vintage memes from the early internet, the Doge meme, which is now a government agency in the United States. It's right there in the upper left corner. Richard Dawkins is the progenitor of the meme idea. He meant it in a more abstract sense of anything that's mimetically reproduced or copied or imitated. So this notion of imitation or mimetic reproduction is fundamentally how the internet works. We take something and we recirculate it through the system. We are nodes in the network, and when we make or receive and transmit or alter a meme, we are participating in mimetic reproduction and circulation of information. We are in the network. The way that this impacts our identity is through the circulation of political ideas through mimetics, through the network. And so this political compass framework is a mimetic framework and a meme that's circulated through the internet and becomes a way of constructing identity. So whereas in the past you had this immersive idea kind of dominating, this was the cutting edge of ideation, of media and identity formation, of interpolation by media, the new cutting edge becomes this circulatory, recursive way of constructing identity. So if this political compass becomes a game board on which people choose positions, and works like Joshua Citarelli's Politogram that look at the history of identity formation and political identification in younger internet users, you can see them moving through these various positions on the board. If you combine that with horseshoe theory, the idea that one extreme naturally snaps over to another extreme, you can kind of see how this movement across the board, with the ability to rapidly flip positions as one matures, as one forms one's own identity in the media environment, as a user on the internet, as somebody in a Discord, as somebody posting on X or Instagram or whatever, this is a fractal identity formation process. We're moving between self-similar positions across the space. And so you can extend that logic to even the formation of cosmologies, meaning that the structuring narrative that people use to understand reality itself, beyond even the relations of power and politics, becomes mimetic, it becomes viral, it becomes fractal in the same way that identity does through conspiracy theories. The idea that the fundamental structuring narrative of your reality is something that emerges from this mimetic stew in the form of a collectively written and unverifiable story about reality that sometimes contains very strange things. So I think the conspiracy theory is, in a way, the story of our time. It's the story and the reality structuring device that is the most related to our media form. In the sense that network media, for most of us, for anyone essentially millennial and younger, Gen X and younger, is they are being interpolated by a network media environment. So the ability to kind of understand that and be aware of that is the way that one builds a kind of reflexiveness or consciousness of these processes and how they're forming our own identities and our own subjects. Some part of us may be essential absent those forces, but growing up inside all of them, this is the language that we use to talk about reality and to talk about ourselves. So that brings us to neural media, our current era. So beginning in 2010, AI algorithms began forming the backbone of ad tech, understanding users on platforms. We had a linear timeline in social media for many years, and then it slowly converted to being algorithmically organized, meaning that those same algorithms that understood users for the purposes of serving ads then became more proactive in determining which content appeared when in the timeline, and that this algorithmic action began restructuring the entire media ecosystem. And so AI was playing a kind of silent role in the background. We weren't quite clear on that it was even happening until it became generative in recent years. And so the structure, the spatial structure of this is high dimensional. It's probably too much to talk about today, but just understand the fundamental underlying mathematics of AI systems are about using high dimensional math. The content is hallucinated and the identity is embedded. And I'll get a little bit into what that means. So neural media, including AI, but not limited to AI, anything that touches the brain, anything that's inspired by neural structures, I would call neural media, produces a high dimensional space with hallucinated content for embedded identities. So these are early cell staining. This is like 1890. This is the first time we saw a neuron. That was later modeled by McCulloch and Pitts in 1943 mathematically. The mechanisms of a neuron were modeled. So the way information flows through these networks was simulated in math. And Alan Turing, 1948, produced another neuronal kind of implementation, a way of doing math over a simple like 5 neuron system. Now, if you imagine that each of these 5 points is a dimension in space, you can get sort of close to the idea of these higher dimensional maths that are behind AI and machine learning. I won't get into the weeds with that stuff, but these translations happen from high dimensions to low dimensions, and this is how we get images like this, early AI generative imagery, but also things like Midjourney and tools that generate images from text. And so one way to understand what's happening here is that you're inside of a statistical distribution. Like an AI system is statistical. When you generate an image, you're looking at some output of that statistical system. And generally, in order for it to work, in order for it to produce a rooster wearing sunglasses or a woman in a white dress in front of a red window, it needs to kind of hit a specific location within the statistical distribution. And generally, that's the mean or the median, the mode, the center point. This is a normal distribution or a bell curve. And so generally, when you see the hallucinated output, it's generated, a generation from an AI system is a hallucination. It's a neural network producing something from within itself. You're looking at a bell curve, or you're looking at some, maybe it's not exactly a bell curve, it might not be a normal distribution, but you're looking at the peak of the curve. You're looking at the most likely thing to come out of the system. So what is the most likely, based on the training data, based on everything it's seen and all of the human feedback, what is the most likely rooster wearing sunglasses? It's something like this. And the prompt might be more elaborate than that. But generally, unless you're being very precise and putting in a lot of like contradictory elements, you're going to land somewhere in the middle of the bell curve. And this is what is now being called slop. I think slop, which generally means kind of AI stuff that doesn't make any sense, but kind of makes sense and is like this, for example, is I found on this X profile called Insane Facebook AI Slop that has some really incredible images. Stuff like this is visually slop, meaning it's coming kind of out of the center of the bell curve. But it's also, so in the sense, slop here means it doesn't make sense. It kind of evokes something that seems to make sense, but when you look closely at it, it kind of falls apart. Everything's melting into everything else. It's got this kind of sticky, disgusting feeling to it. And that's happening because it's visual, but that's also happening demographically in the sense that it's hitting a peak of the bell curve. This is boomer, Facebook, militaristic, jingoistic, Christian nationalist, white nationalist. It's hitting this kind of curve, this like middle of the bell curve in terms of demographics. So it's reinforcing a certain demography. Sometimes it gets weird like this. I mean, this is like kind of revolting, but it's a picture of Christ, but he's kind of made out of like weird animal parts. And then, you know, it can be animated. I don't know if anyone saw this really bizarre animated video, but now the sloth is coming alive. It's even making its way into the physical world via media production or image production that gets produced physically. So this is a store in New York, I guess, and you can see they went ahead and printed this thing, and you can see that none of it makes sense. NY2, NYC, NYC below. I don't even understand what the words are supposed to mean. This is real slop. Like it's just melting and falling apart. And so, you know, when it comes to how this statistical understanding of ourselves can influence our self-perception, the bell curve meme comes to mind. This is a common meme template. In the middle, you have a kind of Redditor nerd type person who's overthinking everything, and then on the right you have the wizard, and on the left you have this kind of idiot, and the idiot and the wizard converge on the simplicity of their thought. But the idea here is that the most people are going to land in the middle of this bell curve, and so what we're encouraged to do here is to see ourselves within a statistical distribution, either at one of the extreme ends because we're a wizard or we're just dumb, or in the peak of the bell curve. And similar things are happening with biosignals. The Aura ring is producing a lot of data about our bodies. This is clearly going to go into machine learning models. We'll somehow locate ourselves within some space in that model, like you are this embedding, this identity within the range of possible human experiences that have been measured and are predictable according to this biometric device. Nobody represents that more than Brian Johnson, whose Don't Die campaign is a multi-million-dollar experiment in preserving his life via biomarkers. He's not necessarily going to live longer. He says he's not going to die, but he will live. He's already he is a certain age in years, but his biomarkers denote a younger body. And he's trying to hack these biomarkers. So he is taking the representation of himself through data as the thing itself, and as the body, as himself. And so this is a mathematical, measured, statistical understanding of his own body that is becoming his mission. The same could be said for the psyche. There are certain psychological theories of dynamical systems, view of psychiatric disorders, potentially mathematical and falsifiable and scientific, potentially not, but it's a provocative idea that the brain, the mind, produces certain patterns of energy, and when it gets locked in certain patterns, you have OCD when the patterns are very deep and you can't move out of them. If the patterns are very shallow and you move quickly from one to another, you have schizophrenia, and where they're balanced, you have the kind of healthy, just right psychic energy distribution. Again, this is a speculative idea that people are discussing in psychology, but it shows a statistical distribution and an understanding of the self as an embedding within a larger space, and I would call it a latent space. And just to expand the picture a little bit, geospatial foundation models are ways of measuring the Earth that produce similar types of mappings, and these can then be used as statistical representations of the Earth itself. And so neural media as AI, when it's connected to various kinds of sensors, biometric sensors, geospatial sensing, media production, produces this statistical space within which our identity is an embedding, and the identity of the Earth itself is an embedding. So we're a bit behind schedule, but so I'm going to end there, and that's the theory of neural media.
I guess, does anyone have any questions quickly? Yeah. Oh, hang on one sec for the mic. wherever the mic is.
You've mentioned in the beginning about the research that you did on the impacts of sound on the human brain. I was just wondering, what were the results of that study?
Yeah, it was not a clinical study, but we did find patterns related to the activation of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system surrounding the presence or absence of voice and language. So the music was structured in a way where there were like long sections of melody and words, which were followed by more ambient gong and synthesizer sections. And we found when people came out of those more ambient sections into the points where voice and language were introduced, that the parasympathetic nervous system would activate, which meant that they were sort of drawing their attention outward. So it was hard to be conclusive. And that was one of the frustrations I had with the project, was that it was qualitative, it was kind of embodied and collective, and it was interesting in that way as an experiment, but it was hard to be really conclusive. And so, certain claims we might make about the scientific importance of what we were doing were really impossible to make within that art context. And it doesn't mean that there's no value in that work, it's observational. But I think when it comes to art and science projects, there was a fundamental tension between producing real scientific results and producing something that was dramaturgically interesting. And so being on the inside of that really gave me some perspective on some of the movements around that to integrate science and art in that way.
May I also ask, how long were the impacts of those? How long did the impacts last?
Sorry, could you say that again, or could you repeat it to the microphone, Daniel?
The second question was how long did the impacts last for?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not sure how. Let me see if I can look at the. I mean, I can. I'll show you the chart. So this was a 40-minute presentation, and you can kind of see slowly these frontal alpha asymmetry is a quick way to measure like sympathetic versus parasympathetic activation. And so you can see, this is probably a 10-minute arc where you go from the deepest part of the ambient section where they're less engaged. So the activation of the parasympathetic nervous system, they named here as disengagement. I'm not sure if that's the best terminology, but you can see the disengagement reaches the peak here, and then it slowly ramps up during this other section. So there's kind of almost a kind of inhale, exhale, kind of very slow quality. So we're talking about maybe 10 minutes across each of these, maybe 15 minutes across each of these peaks here.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Maybe can I just ask one question? I know that we're running out of time, so I don't want to take too much. But I was curious in terms of I know that previously you've talked about neuromedia and this kind of notion of kind of embeddings, and how there's potential to understand embeddings or ourselves in relation to embeddings in multiple kind of ways. Obviously, there's a very sort of technologically determined version of that, which I guess like Brian Johnson would be one like extreme version of that too. So you kind of like optimize yourself in relation to this kind of statistical kind of data around kind of bio markers. And I know you've kind of talked about the potential of sort of understanding ourselves in relation to embeddings, ecological embeddings, I guess. And so I was just curious in terms of like if you could just obviously quickly kind of like expand on sort of that sort of alternate understanding of ourselves, because I think the notion of sort of neuromedia, I think there's one, maybe it's the dominant kind of view or understanding, is that it increasingly becomes our us being embedded in these kinds of systems that are, driven by kind of metadata, and therefore we have to kind of optimize ourselves or understand ourselves in relation to that, where this kind of ecological understanding would be a kind of an alternative understanding of how we do operate within a kind of neuromedia ecology broadly.
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. It's something that in the past, when I've talked about this, I kind of emphasized at the end, and I didn't quite get there this time. But yeah, I think I think maybe this is potentially I'm being very optimistic and hoping that this might be a way to reframe the embedding question, but maybe it can be. So the idea that our identities are embedded, not just in like when we think about this embedding relationship with identity, it's not just that like something takes a picture of you and then it puts that into a map. It's that is happening recursively and iteratively all the time with the various media that we interact with. So it's a formation process in the sense that we are in a feedback loop with it, where it's nudging us. Ad tech is designed to do this. It nudges you in the direction of a certain consumer choice. Or, for example, the more recent politicization of X, formerly known as Twitter, in the direction of Elon Musk's politics. It's nudging the whole timeline in a certain direction. And every time we maneuver within that, we're kind of pushed one way or the other. So it's important to understand this is a dynamic process, and we are being formed by it. So in order to resist that, we would want to look for ways that we're embedded in other kinds of systems. And as I said before, with broadcast media or with any kind of interpolation, the state apparatus, the ideological apparatus that goes beyond the state is constantly shaping us. And if we start to see ourselves as one piece of this dynamic system, then it opens up our sense of who we are as someone who is influenced by these things, that we're coextensive with those things to a certain degree, and we can resist that internally, but we're always in an engagement with it. And so the question of how to think with natural systems, how to think ecologically within this context is a very interesting one, because we could say, well, the ecosystem is also subject to an embedding metadata-based understanding, like geospatial foundation models are essentially that. But the ecosystems themselves are systems of embedding, where we are embedded in an environment and we're in relation with other species. Like the gut biome is like the classic example, right? The bacteria, there's more bacteria than there are cells in my body. How is it that I can imagine myself as an individual given that reality, that I'm embedded in this other system of organisms? And if we can take the notion of embeddedness and the notion of interpolation and subject formation within a dynamical system where forces are interacting with each other, in the kind of media sphere, noosphere, information sphere, does that reflect anything back into our perception of our environment? Can we use that as a way to unlock ourselves from media-based perception and start to think more about what is my organism doing in its embeddedness within an ecosystem, within an environment, as simple as the weather, as complex as the recent fires that destroyed so much of Los Angeles where I live. How am I embedded in that environment, and how is my subject being formed, and how is it forming that environment? This to me is the only the way to thread the needle and kind of get out of the prison of total enclosure. I mean, that dome structure that goes all the way back for a certain period was meant to be liberatory, or was meant to be a visionary environment. You take acid and you see these images and your brain puts together these new things, but really it's an enclosure. And it goes all the way back to the Airways for Peace exhibition. This is a global military infrastructure that becomes the bootstrap for a liberal world order, which has its benefits, but also is a type of enclosure. And so what is the path, what is the way that an embedded perception of the self can unlock the enclosure? I think it is when we start to think ecologically, when we essentially touch grass, like in the more broad possibility of that phrase, when we like literally sense and feel and understand ourselves as embedded within an ecosystem and environment. And this goes back to relations of, if you're interested in this type of stuff, check out Pharmaco AI, my first book. It's a lot about trying to unpack the idea that no species exists alone, and language itself is one of those things that we are kind of in an ecological relationship with.
Yeah, great, thank you. Jen, do you have one? Maybe Jen can have the last question.
I think you've actually perfectly answered that question I was going to ask. It was something around, I'm trying to tie together some of the speakers and what they've talked about across the 2 days. And I think there's this agential layer that people are getting towards. And this agential layer is also an agent that is significantly engaged in self-reflection. And that got me thinking around the part of our brain called default mode network, which historically is around understanding, like periphery wakefulness view, but is also engaging when someone is thinking about themselves. And when you talked about the embedding and how we're understanding ourselves more of an embedding and in an ecological way, that is, I think you've already answered that perfectly, but I just wanted to know what you thought around, like, when bringing back to network media, for example, because we're still operating in network era, although we're already seeing neural media emerging from these networks. So how do we operate as agents or vessels in these networks?
Yeah, I won't elaborate much since it seems like you got sort of what you're looking for, but I will say that the agentic question, the agential question, is an interesting one. And I've been thinking about these 30-year time cycles, and, if that, of course, this is an arbitrary framework, but if that intuition is correct, that they operate in these kind of 30-year time cycles, then that would imply that we're halfway through the neural media cycle, and some inklings of what might come next will probably be appearing, and agenticity may be one of those things. It does have some profound implications for identity, and especially the notion of what is agenticity. It's how does one go from being an NPC to being the main character, is by being agentic and enacting agency. And so some of our psychology even is, I think depression is a lack of agency, or an inability to access one's own agency. And so I think there's probably something really, really cool there that would be worth thinking about. But yeah.
Okay. I'm just going to move here. Thanks very much, Qenric. It's such a great pleasure to have you talk about it. You've been such a great influence on the work that myself and Jen have been doing, and also just as a thing, we're just about to start a 15-week project that's looking at like fashion and neural media. So obviously you've been such a great inspiration and kind of, so thanks very much for coming to the summit.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. I can't wait to see what you come up with.